Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Nguyen, and I am director of the Nguyễn Art Foundation. On behalf of the foundation, I'd like to welcome you all to the next event in our series of educational and public programs in association with the exhibition People, Victory, and Life After the War. This two-chapter exhibition is curated by Gritia Gawi Wong, Artistic Director of the Jim Thompson Art Center in Bangkok, Thailand, in collaboration with our students here at Renaissance School and MSc School. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Gritia, who will share a few words of introduction.
Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Bangkok. I'm Gritia Gawi-Wong, an artistic director of Jim Thompson Art Center, and I'm a guest curator of the exhibition People, Victory, Life After the War, which I co-curated with the students from the MSc International Schools and the Renaissance. I would like to welcome you to the second edition of our online lecture series, a public program of the two chapters exhibition of modern and contemporary art from and about Vietnam from the Nguyen Art Foundation. It is a great pleasure to host the lecture by the important and well-known curator and writer, Zoe Butt, who is no stranger to the Vietnamese art scene. Zoe will give a lecture on her experience and observations of working in Vietnam for more than 10 years. Her practice centers on building critical thinking and historical conscious artistic communities, fostering dialogue among cultures of the Global South. Zoe was artistic director of the Factory Contemporary Art Center in Ho Chi Minh City from 2009 to 2021, executive director and curators at Sans Art from 2009 to 2016, director of international program at Long March Project in Beijing from 2007 to 2009, and assistant curator of contemporary Asian art at Queensland Art Gallery, Brisbane from 2001 to 2007. So this later post focused on the development of its Asia-Pacific Triangle of Contemporary Art. Her curatorial project includes Pollination, started from 2018 to present, and the 14th Chacha Biennale, entitled Leaving the Echo Chamber, and she curated the section called Journey Beyond the Arrows in 2019, Conscious Reality 2013 to 2016, and Sans Art Laboratory from 2012 to 2015. Zoe is currently a PhD candidate at CREAM, Westminster University, London, and she is a visiting curator of the Master of Arts in Curatorial Practice at Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok. She now lives and works in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. So today in this lecture, Zoe will touch upon such questions as, which issues did the artists have to consider in the production and showcase of their art? What issues were they passionate about and why? And what communities do they feel they are most connected to? Where have they found encouragement and support in their decision to commit to art in Vietnam? I hope everyone enjoyed this lecture, and if you have questions, please write them down on Facebook or connect to the staff directly. And at the end of the lecture, Zoe will respond to your question. And I also would like to remind those of you who stay in Vietnam, especially in Ho Chi Minh City, to visit the two chapters exhibition at Nam Long and Van Phuc. And for our public programs, we plan to have one more sessions, and please stay tuned for our updates. And again, thanks for attending this talk, and please join me to welcome Zoe Butt.
Okay, Zoe, the floor is yours now.
Good morning, everyone. And tuning in from Chiang Mai, Thailand, which feels like quite a different place to be talking to people in Vietnam and beyond. But I'm happy to be here, and thank you to Bill, Quinn, and the Nguyen Art Foundation for the invitation to speak this morning. So as Gritya, and thank you, must say thank you to Jill for doing this marvelous show. And it really is worth a visit for all of you who are in Vietnam. Please do go and check it out. But this morning I've been tasked to think about, as Jeb extrapolated, but more simply called, how artists think, research, and care. And you might be wondering why such a question is of any relevance or importance to me. And in a sense, these three entities, thinking, researching, and caring, has been incredibly important to me in my work and my desire to commit to Vietnam over the last 15 years. When I was invited to speak this morning, I was made aware that this was a talk targeting grade 11 and 12 students of the Masi and the general public. And I thought to myself, what would a grade 11 and 12 student most perhaps want to hear from me? What would be more insightful? And I think in a place like Vietnam, where it's a country of such vibrant and dynamic conversations to be said within culture, but yet very few places where you can see contemporary art, I think it's useful to understand a little bit more about what it takes to be an artist, the struggles and the passion and the communities that are necessary to nurture its growth. It's one thing to look at an artwork and see an exhibition, but it's another to ask what's behind the scenes? What does it take to get here? And I think we all need more recognition of what conditions artists face across the world. And in that sense, this morning I'm going to be sharing a little bit about a few Vietnamese artists that I've had the pleasure in working with. But then I will touch upon two other artists, one from the Philippines and another from Afghanistan, just to open up the pool so you can understand that the syndromes and the complexities of working in Vietnam are not dissimilar to other parts of the world. So what started me to think about artists and their work? And why did it become so important? For me, when I was growing up, I learned more about the world and its cultures and its people by looking at art. Artists presented their artworks to me that were more like textbooks, or what I wanted a textbook to be. And growing up in Australia, which is an island that is far, far away from any other place, and it was art that made me feel connected to other people, other cultures, other times, other histories. And for me, this was wonderful to feel that there was so much out there to explore and learn. Artists, for me, often have very unique perspectives. They look at the world differently. They inspired me to learn, to better understand what I'm looking at, to question the stories that circulate around me, and to do my research into whether I agree or I disagree with certain narratives that are rolling around. So I'm interested in what drives artists to make their art, for it's not an easy path. Most struggle to earn a living. Many are not understood by their immediate community. Sometimes their families are not supportive. Thus, what is it that makes an artist so committed? The artists I am personally drawn to feel a critical responsibility to share what they know, to share another way of looking at objects, at people, at history. And this often means that they go to great lengths to find the tools that they need for their art. This can often feel like detective work, as they hunt for the right information, the right physical materials, the right people to realize their art. For you see, art today is not just about studying technique, as is predominantly still taught in the universities in Vietnam. A curriculum that focuses only on what is called the plastic arts, which means the study of painting, lacquer, sculpture, printmaking, and so on. But contemporary art today is employing the tools that are directly in front of all of us. Our telephones, our cameras, our computers, our sound programs, our current engineering technologies, and so on. And artists are experimenting all over the world between traditional languages and contemporary tools, innovating the languages back and forth to think about what we care about. For me, artists are people who make our pasts relevant and accessible. Their thinking and research demonstrates care towards our memories being populated by what matters. And today, I'll share a few stories of my working with particular artists from Vietnam and beyond. I'll just share my screen. I'm trying to share my screen, but I can't. I might need some help, guys.
Are you having trouble sharing the screen?
Yeah, I can't find my my PowerPoint. It's saying can't share your screen.
At the bottom of our screen, you will see a little button that says present now.
Yeah, and I'm going in there and I say go to your entire screen and can't share screen. Oh dear. Hang on a second. I'm so sorry, guys. Let me just fix this. Let's see.
It's okay.
Okay, then hopefully I fixed it.
Yes, it's working now. Sorry, guys, for that.
Can you see a PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank goodness. So sorry. Okay, so moving on. The first artist that I want to speak about is a very important person to Vietnam who has a fabulous show that's just opened in Paris at the Musée de Quai Bonville. But Kidlet is not a stranger to, I'm sure, many people in the room. I had the pleasure of working with them for many years, but this particular project stands out to me. It's called Erasure, realized in 2011 at a place called the Sherman Contemporary Art Foundation in Sydney, in Australia. For this particular project, I learned a lot about Din, and I learned a lot about my own country, Australia. For this was a project that somewhat connected these two countries' histories. For Din is a boat refugee. He is someone who endured some harrowing experiences in fleeing the country. And he was quite struck by the fact that in Australia, it also has a history of a refugee community, in a way, arriving on its shores. He's referring to Australia being colonized by the British, who in 1788, they landed with a big boat by Captain Cook, who, and his boat called Endeavour, landed looking for a place for British convicts to set up home. And at that time in 1788, there were pristine shores and First Nation peoples living there peacefully. But the arrival of these people from Britain caused great pain, a pain that is still being endured and processed today in Australia. And Vinh likened this little story somewhat to his own in fleeing Vietnam and landing in the US and having to amalgamate into another culture and find a place for himself in another place, another time. But he was struck mostly by the boats that traveled across the seas with these peoples who are forced to leave. And you see in the top left an image of a big video production with a boat moving somewhat, you can't see it's a still image, but it was moving somewhat myopically. And then there's thousands of these photographs that are lying face down on the floor. In the production of this particular installation, I recall Dinh commenting of his find of a massive amount of photography in Saigon, in someone's home. It was an antique seller whose entire top floor of his house were these forgotten memories, these forgotten photographs, and they were being sold by the kilo. And it really struck me that there was these memories of Southern Vietnamese being sold by the kilo. And this particular image shows just a slice of the photographs that he ended up collecting for this particular project. And here is a few details of these images that show Vietnamese families, portraits, individuals standing looking for fashion kind of moments, what we might today have called selfies. But what was interesting about this particular installation is it came with a dedicated website, and Dinh was uploading slowly all of these photographs from the floor. And you can see a little desk in the top left image where that's actually me a long time ago, slowly cataloguing all of these photographs into this archive. And in a way, what Dinh was questioning is how do we remember the swath of people that come and go across the world in forms of political need. They're often without a choice that they have to leave, and they're leaving so much behind. So it was an installation that talks about what we leave behind, the objects that are abandoned, in flight, in fear, and how do we as a community, much later, finding this material, how do we give back the meaning to this? And it really struck me the care with which Dinh was looking at these photographs almost as if he was hoping to find himself in here. He was hoping to find some sort of story about his own family, perhaps. Indeed, there was one story of a woman abroad who found a photograph of her family on this online archive. So this project really was a moment of realizing that Dinh Khuê is a person that thinks about his culture's past through a study of what's left behind. And many of those objects for Dinh and his practice has been photographically driven. But then he also researches to a very large extent in thinking about how does Australia's history resonate with my own. And artists will often, when they're asked to do projects abroad, or even sometimes at home a particular site, they think about the relationships between these two subjects. And it's ultimately in how an artist puts these two relationships together that adds a layer to how we understand history, how we understand repetitive histories. For indeed, if we look across the world today, people who are fleeing conflict, I mean, just think about what is happening in the Ukraine today. It is these repetitive histories that artists point out. How are we going to ever stop doing this violence to one another? And this level of care is something that we find across artistic practices all over the world. Another artist that I've had the pleasure of working with is Nguyễn Art. And in 2016, we created together this project called Dislocate, which was showcased at the Factory Contemporary Art Center in Ho Chi Minh City. Both this project and Erasure of Them took a very long time to produce, at least 12 months, sometimes 18 to 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. And working with Kong Khan on this taught me a lot about Vietnamese histories. It took a while for me to really grasp the difficulties of what it means to work with particular materials, in this case, the jackfruit tree. But what does it mean for Bo Khan to think about his culture and his work? I mean, as someone who started out as a painter and then turned to performance, returning to sculpture, he thinks for this particular piece about his family's history, about how he grew up in a place called Hoi An, which holds such tremendous histories that are long and often not readily perceived as a contemporary moment, as in the histories of Hoi An is still present and somewhat contested today. So if we think about the fact that the jackfruit tree in this particular installation comes from Hoi An, and it is a tree that was celebrated by Emperor Ming Mang in the 17th, 1820 to 1841. It was a time when there was a particular famine and food shortage occurring in the country. And so he says to his people, please, we must plant the jackfruit as a national treasure of pride and bounty, because it is a tree that is found across, indeed, not only Vietnam, but much of Southeast Asia. And this bounty is also something that came back as a conversation during the close of the Vietnam War, where there was great famine and food shortage again. And Khan remembers his mother coming up with all of these tremendous recipes using the jackfruit tree. And his father was a carpenter, and he was also using the jackfruit tree wood. So the choice of material here was Khan thinking about his own past, but then he was also aware that the situation of Hoi An historically was in Quang Nam province. It's downstream of the Tu Bon River, comes to prominence in the 2nd century as the commercial capital of the Cham Empire, and it possessed the largest port in Southeast Asia at that time. By the late 1500s, following territorial disputes between what was then the Cham Kingdom and the Dai Viet, the historic name for Vietnam, Hoi An was established as a major Vietnamese trading center in the South China Sea. The town of Hoi An soon possessed a Japanese quarter, and we all know the Japanese Bridge, being a popular tourist destination in Hoi An today. And with the collapse of the Chinese Ming dynasty in 1644, Hoi An also embraced many Chinese refugees, predominantly from Fujian, Guangdong, Chaozhou, and Hainan. And they built pagoda, schools, and medical clinics, amongst many other civic facilities, which you can still see in Hoi An today. Khan actually comes from this lineage of the Ming. And it was a surprise to him when on the left you can see his family shrine. One morning he's with his father, he's climbing the shrine, and he realizes that at the very top there is an image of a very well-known god to the Chinese people. And he looks down at his father and he says, "Father, am I Chinese?" And he says, "Yes, son." And it was a moment to realize that this particular ancestry for him was not something discussed. And he realized that there's so much history around him that isn't confronted. And so he wanted to create a sculpture that amalgamated all of these moments. And on the right, you can see the eventual sculpture itself. It is in the shape of a bunker. A bunker is a military form of architecture that you'll find still across Vietnam. Indeed, they are on the coast of Da Nang. And Khan is interested in how this form of architecture is an item of defense It's used to survey and surveil the seas. And he's also interested in how architecture forms structures of defense within the Chinese thinking. And in that sense, the Penjing, these sculptures that guard north, south, east, and west of this sculpture, call into mind the guardians of feng shui belief. So the carving itself of this sculpture recalls a lot of ancestral Chinese carpentry skill, and Khan worked with some very brilliant carvers from Hui. Indeed, following this project, he found himself still employing many of these carpenters to continue their work because their craft is a dying skill. And that's another level of care that comes into Khan's practice. He really cares for how traditional skill continues in Vietnam. And the research that Khan underwent for this project was also amazing because he was collecting historic photographs. He was collecting these, as you can see on the right, these symbols of the jackfruit tree that are present across Hoi An city itself. And he's also paying attention to the spiritual respect of a jackfruit tree. During the production, I asked him how long is it going to take to realize this installation? And he said, well, that depends on whether I can find a jackfruit tree of decent size that is already dead and that its spirit gives me permission to use its wood. And for that, there were certain rituals that had to take place before he could actually access this particular tree. So not only was he working with traditional craftsmen, he was working with local village experts on how to pay respect to the spirits of this particular village, working with the feng shui understandings of space and architectural design in the creation of this particular sculpture. I learned tremendous amounts about not only Vietnamese understandings, but how the Chinese cultures still have presence in Vietnam today. Another artist, Wan Phi, an incredible thinker and worker of lacquer. And in 2019, at the Factory Contemporary Art Center, we held a solo show for her called Interface, showcasing one of which was Specula, which many of you, I hope, had the chance to visit. This particular show really also taught me a lot about how a contemporary artist can re-energize the concepts, the language, the techniques of a traditional art form into a wholly new understanding that resonates with contemporary thinking today. For Fifi, she considers sap, which is the key ingredient of lacquer from the tree. She considers sap a kind of skin. And in the layering of lacquer, it is thus a layering of skin. And in that, it's not too dissimilar to a human being. Indeed, to most animate and inanimate matter today in the world. When we think about lacquer as a skin, it opens up a whole new world of thinking about what lacquer could be. And what I particularly enjoyed in working with Fifi is she conceives this particular sculpture as being a womb of sorts. It's like entering a cave of nurturing where the surface of the lacquer gives a sense of growth. And it harkens back to the La Salle Caves, which holds some of the most earliest markings of humans. And Fifi was wanting to think about how these caves, not only are we thinking of sap as a skin, but to understand how we produce lacquer, it's the human touch. It takes a lot of rubbing to be able to get these highly polished surfaces and varying kinds of patterns and shapes and symbols and narratives embedded in its surface, which is not too dissimilar to how one of the first paintings in these lasso caves was created, indeed through the human hand. So there's a concept that Fifi refers to called the haptic, H-A-P-T-I-C. The haptic is when we think about touch as a form of knowledge. And Fifi took me on a world where she relates our smartphone device. You know, we all have, even I right now have my smartphone right next to me. We are constantly touching these surfaces every single day. And we assume that these smartphone devices are going to give us access to the world at large. Indeed, they do. But for Fifi, she wants to return to the idea that lacquer is also, through its touch, a form of knowledge, and that we shouldn't ignore how such traditional mediums can become such forms of knowledge still today. And she takes this one step further in her installation called Palimpsest. And this is where she has gone and created these, what she calls lacquerscopes. This is what you can see on the left-hand side. These are handcrafted light projectors where she, instead of funneling a digital image into a light projector, as what we would normally think, she harkens back to the earlier forms of light projections where they were actually glass slides. And these glass slides contain a skin of lacquer, one layer of sap. And she projects these lacquer glass slides through, she inserts the glass slide in this, what she calls the lacquer scope, and beams light through the lacquer to create these projections, these very large scale projections, which you can see beaming in the back. And these are beautiful, dynamic experiences of color. And what I also appreciated about Fifi is how she takes the heaviness of lacquer, because we all know lacquer paintings are very heavy because they carry so many layers of sap. But what she's done here is she's made these lacquer images weightless. And it's in her exploration of this traditional medium in this way that I just found brilliant. And for me, this is what contemporary art is. It's the usage of tools today to take the characteristics, the techniques, and the ideas of these traditions into new forms. And this is something that I find inspirational. And this is why I really value working with artists, because they make me look at traditions in different ways. Another artist that did this for me is Nguyen. And I had the pleasure of working with him on a long-term commission for the Sharjah Biennial in 2019 for a 4-channel piece called The Spectre of Ancestors Becoming. For this particular piece, Nguyen and I together were really inspired by the conversations of history that exist between Vietnam and Senegal. And not many people really understand this connection. What is this connection? Where does it come from? And the journey of research for this particular piece started upon my own journey to Senegal in 2014, when I met a French Senegalese soldier in Dakar who shared with me his eyewitness accounts of seeing the fall of Saigon in 1975. And he then went on to share how he had seen the ordering of the evacuation of Phnom Penh under Pol Pot when this particular soldier was guarding the French medical units. And I realized that I had traveled more than 48 hours across the other side of the world to learn a piece of history about my adopted home that I'd never heard recounted in my adopted home. And so over a 2-year period, Nguyen was researching, and I had the pleasure of walking with him along this journey of research. where he started to understand just how many African soldiers were a part of French military services during World War I and World War II, and then to think about how that had resonance with him as someone who had, as a boat refugee of the Vietnam War. Here you can see a photograph of Senegalese, Guinean, Somali, Tunisian, Vietnamese, Sudanese soldiers in one photograph, all working under the French. And this particular installation tells the tale of 4 particular people who are the descendants of these French Senegalese soldiers who were posted to Vietnam in the 1950s, the 1940s, 50s, who had married Vietnamese wives, who had children. But then in 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam started to earn its independence, and these soldiers were told to go home. And many of them went home without their Vietnamese families. Some took children with them, some didn't. And the Vietnamese Senegalese community that exists in Dakar today are the people that Tuan interviewed, spent time with, continues to be friends with, continues to care for their memories that are not at all recorded or archived in Senegal either today. So for this particular piece, he worked with 4 of the descendants of these fragmented families, asking them to reimagine conversations between their parents, trying to highlight what were some of the biggest tensions that they were facing as a consequence of being ejected out of Saigon. And it was a tremendous experience of trauma, pain, loss, revealed racial tensions in Senegal to this day that still struggle with the Vietnamese diaspora that exists in the city. And some of the photographs that were collected as a consequence, I mean, here you can see a Senegalese man with his Vietnamese great-grandmother photographed holding in his hands. On the bottom left, you see a black and white image of a French Senegalese soldier with his Vietnamese wife. These were moments of a history that don't hold a centralized place of access. And that's indeed what this particular installation is of Tuan for me. It's a form of archive of a particular historical moment that is very difficult to access otherwise. And in this thinking, Tuan took great thinking as to how to make this conversation relevant to this community in Dakar. It is soon an installation that will be showcased in Dakar, in Senegal. And Tuan even took upon himself to collate his research, which consists of photographs, video documentary, and the final work itself, where he put this material together and he sent it to the families for themselves to hold as copies, for themselves to give to their descendants moving forward. So this level of care shows an artist thinking beyond just making objects, beyond just making money, beyond an exhibition history, but thinking of how does their work continue to resonate socially, and how important is it to another human being beyond the languages of what we know art to be today. Another artist that has a very similar sentiment, but this time he's from the Philippines. Kidlet Tahimik is a 5th generation cinema man, well known for his essay films, meaning films that last for sometimes more than 3-4 hours long. His essay films are sometimes never finished, and they are in a constant reassessment of histories. His family is often his cast and crew, and the immediate objects in his home are his props. But he is also an adopted member of the Ifugao tribe in the northern Cordilleras of northern Philippines. And in that, he works with a myriad of local carvers who are tremendous people at making their indigenous stories come to life. And in Kidlet's films, he critiques the film world. And this is an image of an installation from the Sharjah Biennial. I had the pleasure of working with Kidlet to bring his myriad sculptures together in one room. And on the left, you can see the goddess of the winds, which is an inaugural symbol of power. On the right, we see a popular Hollywood symbol, Marilyn Monroe. We may all recall a Marilyn with her red dress and wind blowing her skirts. For Kidlet, who started out in the world as an economist in the US, and then became hugely critical of how he felt the imaginations of the globe were being taken over by Hollywood and its imagery. He returned to the Philippines feeling we have to own our own pasts and better understand where we come from, to be able to speak back to these dominant voices that continue to pump out their narratives, their values, and the images that they think are what we need. And what I learned from Kidlet is what he calls kapwa. And kapwa is an indigenous form of thinking that believes what we give has an impact automatically in that world. So whatever we think, whatever we say, whatever we create forms an impact in another space. And that once we understand how our impact rolls continuously in this cycle, we start to better understand how we need to have respect for the world that is around us. And thus, a lot of what Kidlet works with is recycled. He, on the left-hand back corner of this image, you can see a kind of wave occurring of these sculptures. And these are all vessels of those spirits who have passed on to the next world. And in the Filipino, in Ifugao culture, it is very important to take care of those spirits who have passed to the next world. Working with Kidlet shows me how there are ways to live in the 21st century with languages that are innately part of a particular locality, and that they can be used to speak about larger conversations about consumerism, about how capitalism likes to tell us what materials we think we need to buy and own. And when I visited him in Baguio, on the left, he took me to his Ile Liche cinema, which is entirely a very beautiful wooden carved cinema where the props of his films adorn the walls. So you enter feeling like you are entering one of his sculptures, and you can sit down and watch not only his films, but local films from his community. So for Kidlet, it is about community first and foremost. It's about how local languages can be used to speak back, to critique histories. And in that, I really respect his teaching. It is ultimately what he teaches to his younger community, his older community, his spirit community. His impact sits outside the world of making money, largely. Although we all need money, he is not fixated on this need for money, but more memory and knowledge. Another artist who I had the pleasure of working with, and I realize I have 15 minutes left, so I'll keep this short, an Afghani artist from Bamiyan in the northern parts of Afghanistan, lived as a refugee in Quetta, northern Pakistan, and now lives in Australia. Much of his work deals with the tales of Rustam. And Rustam, you can see populated in this little boat in this embroidery. Rustam is the god of the people, according to the book of the Shahnameh, Book of Kings. And this is a very sacred tome of the Zoroastrian faith. And Rustam is a god today that is manipulated, and it is the poster god of the Taliban. So for Khadim, he's very concerned by how a religious symbol, a god, that is said to be the god of the people, someone who looks after and is compassionate for the people, is now being used as a symbol of Islamic terrorism. So what does that do to this idea of compassion and care and protection? Afghanistan is going through a very hard time right now, where it has been returned to the control of the Taliban. And through his installations, and here you see a very large mural painting, also commissioned for the Sharjah Biennial I curated, where we see Rustam in contemplative modes, staring down at the people, fire aflame above. And this position of power and the god is something that takes contrast with the power of the weapon. And here we see a missile upside down in the left-hand image. On the right, we see an embroidery where surrounding this image of the boat with Rustam as a refugee. These are all symbols of weapons also. And on the right, there's a small image of a textbook, an Afghani textbook, where you learn to count by seeing 1 is the image of 1 Kalishnikov, 2 is an image of 2 daggers, 3 is an image of 3 handguns. This idea of protection has become so closely aligned to being protected by weapons as opposed to faith. And it's in this dialogue between what we believe in, between violence and destruction, that I really have so much questions for me about how the world seems to be governed by weaponry. Indeed, he shares a story of this left-hand sculpture of 2 young people speaking on mobile phones, and they say, "Where should we meet today? Let's meet for a coffee." "Oh, do you mean we should meet for a coffee near the bomb explosion of 12 or the bomb explosion of 21? And they'll say, "The bomb explosion of 21, let's meet there." So suddenly even cities are being remembered for the people who have died and not for the physical landscapes that are around them. I mean, this is quite a harrowing concept, and this is all being reminded through art. So I hope you can see from the artists that I've shared today that thinking, researching, and caring, for me at least, has been a tremendous journey of realizing how personal histories, social histories, political histories, cultural histories, spiritual histories have all come to light to me through walking the journey with artists as they make, as they speak, as they work with differing communities, through their display, but also how they care for their communities. Indeed, Kadim, he decided to fundraise for Afghans still stuck in Kabul, unable to leave the country, and he fundraised through the sale of his art, and he continues to slowly evacuate his friends, family, and colleagues. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully there'll be some questions from you all.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for such an informative and valuable presentation. So while we wait for questions from the floor, I'd like to take this opportunity actually just to express to you how that, it still fascinates me how our different histories and lives across the world, across different peoples and across different periods of time, how all of these histories still continue to intertwine with each other. And throughout your presentation, we can see that you have a tendency, a liking towards working with artists who think and care deeply about their communities and about how issues, both past and present, or to borrow your word, this repetitive history, how it shapes and affects our everyday social, political, and cultural life. My question is, how do you come to be so fascinated by these artists' commitment to society and community? And also in return, how have these artists inspired you to be so committed to this part of the world?
Well, I'm a Hong Kong British background in terms of culture. My Chinese family were traders across great parts of Southeast Asia. And I didn't find this out until I moved to Vietnam. It was not a story that my family shared. And when I realized that I had family in Saigon, a distant family that being, my family turns out is quite large. But I realized, my God, there is so much we don't know. And it all starts from just being prompted. Indeed, it was my cousins in Macau that just started researching and sharing, and I was blown away by how much I'd taken for granted or not looked at. But before that, I had already been fascinated with artists' commitments to their communities, largely through the work I did with the Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art in Australia, where I had the pleasure of working with a number of artists coming from places of great lack. They didn't have museums and galleries, they had no dealers or historians, and much of what they were being tasked to make never made it home. Many of their installations only circulating in Western museums. And it really struck me that these stories were never shown to the people that ultimately would have the most emotional connections to these particular tales. And so it was as a consequence of realizing how much effort and money as a curator, as in part of a museum, doing big exhibitions, that I started to realize there's got to be more going on that I don't know. I really have to go there and figure it out. And that's what made me first move to China and then to Vietnam, and to continue my research with artists across increasingly much of the global South. Because I find that we cannot rely on our universities. We cannot rely on our assumed history textbooks to tell us about the past. Because globally we are seeing that histories have agendas. They're written by people with certain motivations. And we don't always think about what those motivations were when we pick up a book. And I think it's important that we remind ourselves of this when we pick up our smartphones and enter Google. Why was this piece of information placed here? To what end did it benefit the person who posted? And for me, artists are just always, for me, the most open-minded and critical and deeply unflailing in a way of their questioning. I mean, not all artists, I'll say, yes, as you said, I have a particular personal bent towards minds that are attracted to questions. And yes, artists question in all different kinds of ways, but I have a particular bent for social histories. But I think it's just taught me so much, and it sustains me, I think, because my own history is still so unknown and still a journey.
Thank you, Zoe. We have some questions from the floor. I'm going to read them out for you, okay? So one question is, you've lived and worked in Vietnam for more than a decade and have been able to both initiate and witness some of the country's most exciting art historical moments. It's been a long journey for our art scene since you first set foot here. What do you think has changed or improved? What else do you think we can do to help our scene thrive even more?
Well, that's a big question. Indeed, there has been a lot of change. It's been 15 years of working in Vietnam. And, you know, when I first arrived, most of the scene was in Hanoi, and everyone questioned why I would move to Saigon. But then we saw a sea change of roughly around 8 years ago, where we saw many Hanoian artists come to Saigon. We saw many Viet Kieu from overseas returned to Vietnam, and we saw a lot of increased collaboration occurring between North, Central, and South, particularly in the last 5 years. That exchange has occurred. And the development of a contemporary Vietnamese art, hands down, has been the legacy of artists. It is through artists working collectively, pushing their own languages together. Like you've got so many artist collectives across the country, Nha San Collective, Hanoi Doc Club, San Art, Mott Plus. There's just so many that I don't dare list them for fear I leave one out. But I think what has been tremendously rewarding for me is that even though the country still has no financial support of any regularity, that it still doesn't have a university system that teaches comparative, competitive understandings of an international contemporary art, that its collector base is still very small, but growing, but still incredibly small, and that its artists within such lack still find the commitment, the resilience to continue. I mean, that for me has driven me. That for me has been so inspirational. And what I hope that we can see in the future is artists understanding more of the social agency in being able to provide for another generation. And I really deeply hope that there can be more attention paid to education. And this is one of the reasons why I'm very grateful to the Nguyen Art Foundation, to Nguyen and her Massey schools for her commitment to understanding the nexus between education and culture. And this is, for me, absolutely crucial. We can invest all we want in terms of money, in terms of physical structures for gallery spaces and fun, funky little spaces to be able to do events here and there. But if you do not have artists to fill those spaces, if you can't actually give these spaces artistic practices that say things that can represent, and by represent, I mean, are we making because we just want to show things within the borders we understand? Do we make things in Vietnam just to be understood in Vietnam? Or do we understand ourselves as global citizens, where the amount of plastic waste we consume has global ramifications, where the air pollution that we pump out has global ramifications? Do we take upon ourselves that same responsibility with our cultural work? So I guess in answer to that question, I sincerely hope that there's more investment and understanding on the part of artists and supporters with the need for education. And then secondly, to really question where we're speaking, to who, and to really raise ourselves with ambition on that level, because it's there in Vietnam. It's totally there.
Thank you so much, Zoe. I think we may have time for one last question before we can let you go. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay, so I think I'm going to merge these two questions together. How do you choose the artists you work with? But I think in your previous replies, you have already kind of touched on this and throughout your presentation as well. And I guess the other question would be, how do you see yourself in the role of a curator in the artist's journey of bringing to light their personal, cultural, and political histories?
Very good question. How do I choose my artists? I would say artists choose me, actually. Most of my past, I have actually been approached by artists. In that journey, I really, how did that happen? Through friendships. I mean, I keep in contact with many different artists across the world on a pretty constant basis, and it's not for the purpose of doing an exhibition, it's not for the purpose of anything really, I'm just interested in what they're doing. I ask to keep in conversation, and I'll call and we'll have phone messaging and we're just sharing information. I'm not wanting anything. And then more often than not, I'm asked to work with them. That's how the predominant journey has been. The second thing sorry, Bill, if you could just remind me that second question.
The second question was, how do you see your role as a curator in the artist journey?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, as a curator, I want to learn something. If I'm not learning something, I struggle. I feel almost like I'm just a little bored. I need something to trigger my sense of interest, or something I don't know. I'm attracted to what I don't know. And so when it comes to working with artists, I'm given material to look at. Check this out, here's an image. Check this out, here's a text. Check this out, here's a video. Check this out, here's a sound recording. And then there's this conversation. What do we think? What do you think of that? Oh, it reminds me of this. Oh, it reminds me of that. Oh, cool. Can you share that with me? I'd like to see what you're talking about here. I'd like to hear about what you mean by that. Oh, I know this person who might actually be able to say something different to that. Shall we talk to him? Yeah, let's talk to him. We'll go together. And so this process of learning it's not about the artist telling the curator what to do, the curator telling the artist what to do. It's a genuine interest in what we're exploring. I mean, do we benefit from each other's work? Absolutely. I mean, for me as a curator, my skill is to write and to speak. I don't have anything to write or to speak about if I have no content. So the artist gives me content. That's my benefit. What does the artist get out of it? Perspective. The artist might choose to look at a piece of a material, a wood, a piece of history, an image, and they see something in one way. But then by talking about it to someone, they've got a differing opinion and they're struck by how different that opinion is. Should I take care of that? Should I embrace it? Do I need to acknowledge it? Does it point me in a different direction? So by sharing in the process of making, what I've found is I get better at writing and speaking about an artist and their practice because I can see what matters to the artist. Suddenly I'm aware, like in most of the long-term commissions that I've had the pleasure of doing, I can see as a consequence the pain that goes into deciding what to include and what not to include. It's painful, especially when you're dealing with histories. And that pain rarely is given presence in the final object that goes on display. You don't have any idea, unless a curator hints at it when they write and they speak. Which is very different to, say, being a curator that's just looking at the final object, because you won't have the hint to know that there's other experiences rolling behind this particular object. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Zoe. I think that was such a beautiful way to wrap up our event today. The fact that you stressed on the importance of learning from each other and with each other as curators, as artists, but also as viewers of art. We all have a role in contributing into the construction and the reinterpretation of narratives throughout history. And you know, it's beautiful that you talked about friendship, because it is something that you have written about extensively. And you and I, we have also co-curated with our colleague Bao on the exhibition in the ongoing project Spirit of Friendship. You know, it is something that explores friendship as a medium that kind of glues together all these different aspects and periods of his art history in Vietnam. And I hope that we can continue to do our part in also create new histories for the next generation to, you know, in the future, dig up and learn for themselves. So once again, thank you so much, Zoe, for spending this morning with us. We've loved your presentation. And of course, there are so many questions here I could see for you. And I guess we could later maybe pass on the questions for you.
Sure.
And you could maybe spend some time to write your reply.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you again.
Thank you for
To
the invitation.
everyone else, thank you so much for joining us this morning. There will be more coming from the Nguyễn Art Foundation in the next month or so. We still have one more public program in association with our current exhibition, and soon we will share with you information on our next exhibition, which will open hopefully in May. Thank you everyone once again for taking part and for joining us this morning. Thank you, Zoe.
Bye.
Goodbye.